As I was listening to Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble and drinking tea from my grandmother's china, I was thinking about all of the stuff that I didn't know about China before I started teaching. And I was also thinking about a myth that many of us as teachers were taught, or some of our students learned, that China was isolated or closed. And I want to talk today about how these kind of myths or misrepresentations of the past can really interfere and make it difficult for us to help our students see world history from a perspective that is not interfered as much with our contemporary political viewpoints and making it hard for us to move forward with that world history narrative. And one that you probably know about is we used to teach that Columbus discovered America, but we know that that's not really the right verb to use. He certainly encountered the Americas. And so today when I talk about China not being closed or not being isolated, those are some of those same verbs that can interfere. So where did my story about China or with China begin? And that was back in 1980, the summer of 1980. I got a chance to go and study Chinese in China, but I was so naive. I was 19 years old and I just really didn't know very much. In fact, I thought since China was a communist country that they didn't use currency. That's just one of many silly misunderstandings or kind of myths I had, because I'd been taught that under communist governments that everyone is treated somewhat equal, and so therefore there would be no need for money. So today we're going to talk about the evidence that we can use to understand ourselves as teachers, and then also make sure our students understand this narrative of world history in which China is interacting very much with the world. And the evidence I'm going to show you that is used often to show that China was closed but is misused is the Great Wall. We'll talk about the Great Wall, we'll talk about the end of the Ming Navy, and we'll talk about the Opium Wars. So those are the three pieces of evidence that are often brought up to explain this narrative that China was closed and had to be opened by outsiders like Americans or the British. The evidence I'm going to use to show you that China was integrated is china, or what we call porcelain, tea, and silk. So let's start on our journey. And you saw a photograph that I took back in 1980 of the Great Wall. You can see it. And it's one that I'm sure that you've seen, various versions, photos of the Great Wall. And the Great Wall was actually not built to close Chinese or China off from the world, but was a series of forts on a border up in the northwest part of China to regulate movement in and out. But there were in fact Chinese people and people who weren't Chinese or didn't consider themselves subjects to the Chinese government who lived on both sides of the wall, who were what we might call semi-nomadic, who were farmers but also very much involved in the trade along the Silk Road. So the Silk Road and trade was a way for the Chinese government through the Great Wall to tax merchants, to check on the credentials of diplomats. So it was never really, except in the midst of maybe a war, used to try to keep people out. The map that you see is a typical map showing the Silk Roads, some on land, right, across Central Asia, and some on the sea. And these Silk Roads were ways for the Chinese to export their goods. And their goods are so important in world history, right? The china, we call it china, it's porcelain. We in the western part of the world, west of China, call it China because we're so impressed with what they were able to do. They exported tea and they exported silk. And in fact, these products are so important in the world history narrative that I teach my students that I taught them an acronym, T, S, and P. And for those of them who cook, they know that a teaspoon, right, is often used to stir or to measure. And so TSP, tea, silk, and porcelain, products from the Han Dynasty all the way up through the early modern period and maybe really into the 20th century were products that everybody else in the world very much wanted from China. So China was clearly not closed. Great Wall didn't close it off, and definitely the demand for Chinese products continued to keep these routes, these trade routes, very active. You saw on the map a picture of a Chinese pilgrim, a Buddhist pilgrim. So Buddhism was one of those ideas or products that came into China. So I don't want to just say, and we don't want to teach our students, that the Chinese just exported, right? They were also importing. And so as we move along and talk through world history, we want to make sure that we show the interaction, right? Not just the Chinese exporting, but also importing ideas, products, ideas like Buddhism. This map shows us the sea routes of the Ming Navy under the Admiral Zheng He. They took maps with them. They displayed Chinese power throughout the Indian Ocean, and in fact all the way over to East Africa. And today in Kenya, there's a community of Kenyans who view their ancestry going all the way back to some of the crew on those ships. The Ming Navy did not last for very long, a couple of decades, and when it ended, some world history narratives say that the end of the Ming Navy and the so-called withdrawal of Chinese power from the Indian Ocean then opened up the way for Europeans like the Portuguese to then dominate the Indian Ocean. But we know that domination by Europeans didn't come until much later, and the Chinese didn't so much withdraw themselves from the Indian Ocean, but redirected the funds to the Navy, to the Army, to be able to withstand Mongol attempts to reconquer China from the northwest. And the Chinese merchants continued to trade with the world. So the end of the Ming Navy is not China closing itself off, not isolating itself, not saying that they didn't want to interact with the world. In fact, those interactions, especially trade, continued. So how do we know this? How do we know that the Chinese continue to be so active, in addition to tea, silk, and porcelain, that were continue to be popular amongst consumers in many parts of the world? But when the Spaniards took over the Americas and they discovered silver, and they started to mint silver, which became known as pieces of 8, right? You may know about this. This silver then became very important in China, and the Spaniards then exported that silver across the Pacific to the Philippines, a colony they created in honor of their king Philip II. The Chinese merchants came to the Philippines, the Spanish merchants across the Pacific on their Manila galleons brought silver and then bought Chinese goods. This silver then really created, according to most world historians, the global economy. So this demand of the Chinese, because they had changed their taxation system in which all taxes had to be paid with silver, but the Chinese didn't have silver, so they had to import that silver. Some world historians have estimated that maybe 12 million pesos went across the Trans-Pacific trade, and in fact, at times, this trade across the Pacific from the Americas, Acapulco, for example, the port at Manila in the Philippines, was over 1 million pesos greater than the transatlantic trade before the height of the horrible transatlantic slave trade. So, Great Wall, not a reason to say the Chinese were isolated or closed. The end of the Ming Navy, definitely not a reason to say it's closed. But silver is going to take us to the last piece of evidence, or the part of the story, the narrative that we can help our students see in world history. And that has to do with opium. So I'm sure all of you teach about the Opium War, and you teach that at first British use of the Spanish or what we call Mexican dollars created a trade deficit for the British. So one way that they fix this trade deficit was to illegally export Indian opium to China, and slowly but surely, because opium is addictive, the Chinese consumers, through Chinese merchants working illegally with the British and American merchants, then shifted that trade balance in favor of the British and a negative for the Chinese. But the Chinese continued to be an important part of the global economy, and the fact that the British won the Opium War, and then throughout the 19th century there was competition amongst these European, American, and later Japanese merchants to try to control pieces of the Chinese economy. It didn't make China isolated or closed. They didn't need outsiders to open them up, just like today they don't need to be opened up or taught about the global economy. They have a lot of experience with that. And so when we teach our students that if we allow that misunderstanding, that myth that China was closed or isolated, then it disrupts all of this evidence that I've been presenting to you. So how can we pull all of this together into one narrative? So certainly a continuity is that the Chinese were very much involved in exporting tea, silk, and porcelain. They had moments in their history or developments like the Great Wall, the end of the Ming Navy, the Opium War, in which they are interacting with the outside world in a way that has to do with power. So we might want to make those moments of change, right? So the continuity of the trade, but the moments of change in which perhaps power has shifted. But we always just want to make sure that our students understand that it's the evidence is so important. So this is a map of the Trans-Pacific trade, very important today, and it does have to do with money, right? So let's go back to that story of the naive 19-year-old I was, thinking the Chinese didn't have money. But in fact they did, and here are some examples of Chinese currency today. Can help you if you want to directly buy products in China. And we just want to keep in mind that interaction, not isolation, not separate civilizations, is the narrative that we want our students to learn when they learn world history.